She told me straight to my face, "Your mailbox is illegal, and I'll keep running it over until you fix it." Imagine hearing that from a neighbor. Not whispered in passing, not as some ugly rumor, but declared right there in my driveway with her arms crossed and that smug little smirk. Her name was Karen Monroe, though everyone around Cedar Glen already knew her by another title, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. At first, I thought maybe I'd misheard her. Who admits to a crime like that? Who brags about destroying federal property with their own SUV? But the proof was right there at my feet. My mailbox wasn't just dented, it was splintered and twisted like it had been hit with a wrecking ball. Shards of metal lay scattered across the grass, my mail shredded and flapping in the wind. And it wasn't the first time. No, this was the third. 3 times in a single month my mailbox had been flattened. The first time I brushed it off as bad luck. Maybe some delivery truck clipped it on accident. The second time I wondered if a reckless teenager had taken the corner too fast. But the third time there was no mistaking it. This wasn't bad luck. This was deliberate. Someone wanted my mailbox gone. And that someone had just confessed. That night I stood in the dim light of my porch, staring at what was left of the mailbox. The sound of crickets buzzed in the background, but all I could hear was Karen's voice echoing in my head. I bent down, scooped up a handful of crushed envelopes, and that's when I saw it, fluttering from the railing like a cruel joke. A neon pink slip. Violation notice, non-compliant mailbox, immediate replacement required. I laughed out loud, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh you make when you realize you're being toyed with. I'd seen this tactic before. The HOA rules were her weapon of choice, and she wielded them like a hammer. But this time, she hadn't just cited me. She'd smashed my property with her own bumper and then fined me for it. I could still hear the creak of my front gate as I walked back inside. I tossed the violation slip onto the kitchen counter, my hands trembling with anger. My first instinct was to call the HOA office, but I knew better. Around here, the HOA office was just Karen's personal voicemail. She never answered in real time. No, she liked making people wait, calling back when it suited her, like she was some kind of monarch granting an audience. Still, I left a message. My voice was calm but cold. "This is Dr. Marcus Hale, 214 Cedar Glen Drive. My mailbox has been destroyed again. I found your violation notice. Call me back immediately. We're going to have a serious conversation." 20 minutes later, as I sat on the back porch with a beer in hand, the phone buzzed. Caller ID, Karen Monroe. I let it ring twice. I wasn't about to jump at her command. Then I picked up. Her voice dripped with sweetness that barely covered the steel beneath. "Dr. Hale, I assume you got the notice." "Oh, I got it," I replied, "along with the destroyed mailbox you conveniently forgot to mention." Her response, a laugh in actual laugh. "Your mailbox was non-compliant," she said. "Oversized, wrong color, no brass accents. It didn't fit the uniformity of the neighborhood." "Uniformity?" I snapped. "You mean you running it over 3 times with your SUV? Mrs. Harris saw you, and I bet the dent in your bumper matches the wreckage in my yard." Karen didn't flinch. She didn't even deny it. "If your mailbox was in compliance, maybe it wouldn't have been in the way," she purred. I gripped the phone so tight my knuckles ached. "That's not how this works. A mailbox is federal property. Destroying it is a felony. Do you understand that?" Silence, then that sing-song tone she used when she wanted to remind people she was in charge. "Rules are rules, doctor. You signed the covenant. If you don't like it, maybe Cedar Glen isn't the right neighborhood for you." And with that click, she hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, my jaw clenched. That was when I heard footsteps on the gravel. My neighbor, Frank Dalton, a retired Marine, strolled up with his usual calm swagger. He glanced at the wreckage on my lawn. "Karen," he asked. "Karen," I confirmed. He spat into the grass. "Figures. She's been after you since you fought her on those garden lights. She doesn't like anyone who pushes back." I kicked a piece of twisted metal. "She picked the wrong guy this time." Frank's grin spread wide. "Good, about time someone gave her hell." That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I spread the HOA covenant across my dining table, its pages yellowed, reeking of mildew and bureaucracy. 123 pages of tiny print misery. But buried in the middle in section 14.2, I found what I needed. All violation notices had to be delivered in writing, physically, with a 14-day grace period. Karen hadn't done that. Her violation slip appeared after the fact, after my mailbox was destroyed. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of control. But as I stared out the window at the mangled heap at the end of my driveway, another thought hit me. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce a rule. She was trying to break me, and if she wanted war, well, she just declared it. Because the next mailbox I built, it wouldn't just be a mailbox. It would be a fortress. The next morning, I walked down my driveway in the gray light of dawn, boots crunching against the gravel, and stared at the wreckage one last time. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt, a storm still lingering from the night before. My neighbors had already started their routines, sprinklers hissing, garage doors humming open, but all I could focus on was that neon slip still taped to the railing, mocking me. 7 days to replace, $25 a day if I didn't, a $150 removal fee already charged. The math rattled in my head like a ticking clock. Karen hadn't just vandalized my property. She was trying to bleed me dry one fine at a time. And that was when the fury settled into something sharper. Cold, calculated. If she wanted to use the covenant against me, I'd turn it into a weapon of my own. That afternoon, I drove straight to Mrs. Harris's bungalow. Her porch always smelled like cinnamon tea, and when I knocked, she was already waiting, thermos in hand, eyes sharp as ever. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I saw her, Marcus," she said, backed up slow like she was checking her mirrors, deliberate, not an accident. "Would you swear to that if it came down to it?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "I've lived here 35 years, I've seen bullies come and go. That woman is the worst of them. Yes, I'll swear to it." She even pulled out her phone, showing me a shaky clip she'd recorded the week before. Karen's gleaming SUV nosing into another neighbor's curb, the camera catching the faint crunch of impact before she pulled away. It wasn't crystal clear, but it was something. When I left her porch, my hands shook with equal parts anger and adrenaline. Evidence, that was the first step. By evening, I'd gone door to door. People who usually kept their heads down suddenly opened up when I asked direct questions. The Ruiz family remembered Karen circling my property the night before the third accident. Their son even had a GoPro clip of her SUV idling near my driveway. A quiet man from 2 houses down admitted he'd watched her clip my mailbox and drive away without a glance back. Whispers turned into statements. Statements turned into witnesses. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about me. Karen had been playing demolition derby with all of us, just in smaller ways: garden lights, shutters, basketball hoops, petty fines that stacked up until people gave in. By the time I got home, the sun had set. My boots tracked mud into the kitchen as I dropped everything onto the table: Harris's video, the GoPro footage, names and dates scribbled in a notebook. The HOA covenant sat open like a weapon. And then, almost by accident, I stumbled on something bigger. A quick Google search, nothing more than curiosity, pulled up the federal statute. 18 U.S.C. Section 1705. Whoever willfully or maliciously destroys a mailbox can be fined or imprisoned for up to 3 years. 3 years? I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. This wasn't just HOA drama anymore. This was federal. The sound of my refrigerator humming filled the silence. Outside, cicadas screamed in the trees. I rubbed a hand over my face and laughed under my breath. Karen had no idea. She thought this was a game of fines and intimidation. She didn't know she was skating into felony territory. But I knew something else too. People like her don't back down when confronted. They double down. If I wanted to beat her, I couldn't just wave a statute at her face and expect her to crumble. I needed something she couldn't spin, couldn't destroy, couldn't bully away. That's when my eyes drifted to the twisted heap outside. What if she came back again? What if I replaced it with another wooden post and flimsy tin box just for her to flatten again next week? No, that wasn't an option. I needed a mailbox she couldn't touch. The idea started as a joke in my head. What if I built one so solid it outlasted the house? But the longer I sat there, the more it turned into a plan. Steel, concrete, Reinforcement, something that didn't just hold letters but made a statement. By midnight, I had sketches on a yellow legal pad. Reinforced posts, concrete footings, a steel box painted in the exact forest green shade the HOA required, with polished brass numbers so even Karen couldn't say it was non-compliant. I went online, searching through catalogs and specialty shops. Did you know there are companies that build tamper-proof mailboxes strong enough to survive baseball bats, sledgehammers, even gunfire? Neither did I until that night. And then I found it, the Fort Knox. Quarter-inch steel walls, 80 pounds of indestructible glory, a mailbox built like a bank vault designed to laugh at vandals and weather alike. Price tag, $350 plus shipping, but compared to Karen's threats, it felt like a bargain. I clicked add to cart, but not before confirming one crucial detail. I called the company, the rep chuckling on the other end. Yes, sir, it meets standard dimensions. Same size as a normal box, just heavier. You could hit it with a truck and it wouldn't budge. Music to my ears. As I hung up, I could almost see it standing proud at the end of my driveway, a fortress disguised as compliance. A monument Karen could slam her SUV into 100 times without leaving so much as a scratch. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. My hands still trembled, but not from fear anymore, from anticipation, because this wasn't just about mail. It was about drawing a line in the sand. And I was done watching Karen stomp across it. Friday came sooner than I expected. The Texas sun had barely risen when the rumble of a diesel truck echoed down Cedar Glen Drive. My buddy Mike pulled up, his cement mixer rattling in the back like a tank rolling into battle. He hopped out in steel-toed boots, grinning ear to ear. "Doc," he said, clapping my shoulder, "you ready to bury this thing deeper than Fort Knox itself?" Neighbors had already started gathering, curiosity pulling them out like moths to a flame. Mrs. Harris brought her folding stool and thermos. The Ruiz kids sat cross-legged on the curb, whispering like they were about to watch a magic trick. Even quiet Mrs. Whitaker shuffled down her driveway, her little dog yapping in approval. And across the street, Frank Dalton had set up in his lawn chair with binoculars dangling from his neck, cooler full of beer at his side. "Best show in town," he hollered. The delivery man who had dropped off the new mailbox the night before was still fresh in my mind. He'd struggled with the dolly, muttering, "What the hell do you have in here, bricks?" I had just grinned and said, "Something better." Now that forest green steel box sat on my driveway, gleaming in the morning light like a jewel Karen couldn't touch. Mike and his crew started digging. Shovels clanged against the rocky soil, sweat pouring down their brows before the clock even hit 9. The hole grew wider, deeper, until it looked less like a post hole and more like the foundation for a monument. Every scoop of dirt felt like rebellion, every scrape of steel against stone like a promise we weren't backing down. By the time the cement mixer roared to life, the neighborhood had swelled into a small crowd. Cameras clicked, phones recorded, and I couldn't help but notice curtains twitching down the block. Karen's beige McMansion sat silent, blinds drawn, but I could almost feel her eyes boring through the glass. We lowered the reinforced steel post into the hole. 3 feet deep, rebar laced through like the bones of a skyscraper. Mike nodded with satisfaction. "Doc, if anyone wants to move this thing, they'll need a backhoe." The concrete poured thick and gray, swallowing the post in slow, steady waves. The smell of wet cement hung heavy in the air. Kids pointed, neighbors chuckled, Mrs. Harris sipped her tea with a smirk. For the first time in weeks, the street buzzed not with fear of fines, but with something else: unity. By noon, the job was done. The Fort Knox mailbox stood tall, brass numbers gleaming, every angle perfectly compliant with HOA regulations. To the untrained eye, it looked ordinary. To us, it was a fortress, a monument to stubbornness and justice. When the last bolt was tightened, Frank raised his cannon salute. "Doc, I think you just built the first Karen-proof mailbox in Travis County." The crowd laughed, clapped, and cheered. For a moment, I wasn't just a doctor tired from long shifts at the hospital. I was the man who finally stood up. And the neighborhood, they were standing with me. But victory has a way of drawing predators. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I mounted a small security camera in the oak tree by the curb. Its lens pointed squarely at the mailbox, waiting for the inevitable. Karen wasn't the type to let this pass. She would come. I just didn't know when. I didn't wait long. The next morning at precisely 9:07, her white SUV crawled down the street. The engine idled like a predator circling prey. I stood behind my blinds, phone recording in hand, heart pounding in my chest. She parked at the curb, heels clicking as she stepped out, tape measure and clipboard ready like she was about to conduct surgery. She crouched low, measuring the height, the distance from the curb, the tilt of the post. Her eyes narrowed as the tape snapped back over and over, each number confirming compliance. Then she shoved at the mailbox with both hands. Nothing. She kicked the base. Still nothing. Finally, she leaned her full weight against it, jaw tightening as the box stood solid, immovable, indifferent. The camera caught every second. The scowl twisting her lips, the muttered curses, the twitch in her jaw. When she finally stormed back to her SUV, scribbling furiously on her clipboard, my group chat exploded. Mrs. Harris, she's out there measuring like a madwoman. Frank, she just tried to body slam it. Mailbox wins. Ruiz kids, she looks like she swallowed a lemon. I couldn't stop smiling. Round one, me. But I knew Karen too well. She wasn't going to slink away in silence. She was going to escalate. Sure enough, by late afternoon, a white pickup marked Cedar Glen Maintenance rolled up. Two men climbed out, eyeing the mailbox like it was a puzzle. One tapped the side with his knuckles and burst out laughing. Is this thing steel? I stepped out casually, hands in my pockets. Is there a problem, gentlemen? They shook their heads, chuckling. Nope, it's within code, just sturdier than usual. They climbed back into the truck and drove off, leaving me standing in the golden light of evening with a grin so wide my cheeks hurt. That night I finally slept soundly. No nightmares of crushed mailboxes, no replaying Karen's smug voice. Just the steady hum of cicadas and the quiet knowledge that the battlefield had shifted. But peace, especially under a tyrant, never lasts long. Because the very next evening, Karen came back. And this time, she didn't come alone. The following evening, just as the cicadas started their nightly chorus and the street lamps flickered to life, Karen returned. But this time, she didn't come alone. Her gleaming SUV rolled to a stop at the curb, headlights cutting across my yard like search beams. Out stepped Karen in her sharp blazer, heels striking the pavement with a rhythm that screamed control. Behind her shuffled her husband, pale and quiet, clutching what looked like a massive pipe wrench. And trailing behind them was the head of the HOA maintenance crew, hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. I was watering my tomato plants on the porch, hose in hand, pretending not to notice until the moment was just right. Then I called out, voice casual. Evening, folks, can I help you with something? Karen jolted, caught off guard before straightening and forcing a smile. Dr. Hale, she said smoothly, your mailbox appears unusual. Unusual? I echoed, shutting off the hose and leaning against the porch rail. It's forest green with brass numbers, exactly what the covenant requires. Her husband shifted nervously, wrench dangling like a guilty secret. The maintenance man glanced at Karen, uneasy. Karen sniffed, pressing on. It's not the approved model. The regulations specify. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folded, highlighted copy of the covenant, the pages already worn from study. Color and style, I interrupted. Not brand, not model. Forest green with brass numbers. That's compliance, Karen. Would you like me to read it aloud? The maintenance man cleared his throat, eyes darting between us. She's right, Mrs. Monroe. It matches the requirements. For a moment, Karen's face drained of color before flushing red. Her lips pressed tight. She turned to her husband, whispering something sharp. His knuckles whitened around the wrench. Were you planning to remove my mailbox again? I asked, my voice firm now, because just so you know, that's tampering with federal property, a felony. I pointed to the oak tree where my security camera's tiny red light blinked steadily. And everything happening right now is being recorded. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen froze. Her husband dropped the wrench into the grass with a dull thud, and then from across the street, a burst of laughter broke the tension. Frank, of course, he sat in his lawn chair, phone aimed squarely at us, beer in hand. "Smile, Karen," he hollered. "You're on camera." One by one, neighbors began appearing like shadows turning solid. Mrs. Harris lifted her iPad, recording the whole scene. The Ruiz kids whispered excitedly, chanting "Mailbox, Mailbox," under their breath. Even Mrs. Whittaker clutched her little dog at the edge of her lawn, shaking her head with a wry smile. Karen's composure cracked. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her voice trembling. "A circus." "No," I said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "What's ridiculous is destroying someone's property and pretending it's enforcement. What's ridiculous is thinking no one will ever stand up to you." Her eyes blazed. She spun on her heel, storming back to the SUV. Her husband scrambled after her, wrench abandoned in the grass. The maintenance man followed reluctantly, muttering something under his breath. Seconds later, her tires squealed against the pavement, the SUV roaring down the street like a wounded animal retreating. The moment she disappeared, the neighborhood erupted. Applause, cheers, even laughter. Frank raised his can in salute. Mrs. Harris called out, "You showed her, Marcus." The Ruiz kids hopped in circles like they'd just watched the final round of a championship fight. I stood there in the glow of the streetlight, breath slow, steady. For the first time, it wasn't just me against her. It was all of us. But as the cheers faded and the neighbors drifted back inside, I felt that old tension creep in again. Because I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She would come back harder, louder, more desperate. And when she did, she wouldn't just bring a wrench and a clipboard. She'd bring the entire board. And I had to be ready. That night, long after the crowd had gone and the crickets had taken over the soundtrack of Cedar Glen, I sat at my dining table again. The Covenant lay open in front of me, tabs sticking out like a legal minefield. Beside it, my growing evidence folder. Photos, witness statements, video clips, even the shaky recording from Mrs. Harris's phone. Every scrap mattered. Every detail could be the piece that tipped the scales. The truth was, this fight had grown beyond one mailbox. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about all of us. The neighbors fined for shutters, for gnomes, for tulips, for chalk drawings on sidewalks. Karen's rule wasn't governance. It was intimidation dressed up in legal jargon. And intimidation only works until someone shines a light on it. I knew the light was coming soon, because the next round wouldn't be on my driveway. It would be in that stuffy beige community center, under fluorescent lights, in front of a packed room where the whole neighborhood would finally see her for what she really was. And I was going to make sure of it. The night of the HOA meeting felt different from all the others. Normally, those gatherings were half-empty affairs, 10 chairs filled, 15 left vacant, the same tired faces yawning while Karen droned through fines and landscaping lectures. But that evening, as I pulled into the cracked parking lot of the Cedar Glen Community Center, I knew something had shifted. Cars lined the street for 2 blocks. Voices carried across the asphalt. The air buzzed with something I hadn't felt in years in this neighborhood. Anticipation. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a pale, unforgiving glow. The folding chairs, usually empty, were packed shoulder to shoulder. Neighbors who'd never spoken more than a polite hello were crammed together, murmuring, clutching notebooks, phones, and even manila folders of their own. At the front of the room sat the long plastic table of the HOA board, and in the middle of it, wearing her trademark smirk like a crown, sat Karen. She banged the gavel against the table. "Order," she said crisply. "We'll begin with the agenda." But before she could continue, Frank Dalton's booming voice cut across the room. "We've got an agenda too, Karen, and it's not your usual nonsense." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Karen's eyes narrowed. She scanned the room, clearly unsettled by the sheer number of faces staring back at her. She cleared her throat. "Well, as president, it's my duty to." I stood up slowly, folder in hand, and every whisper went quiet. The sound of my boots against the tile floor echoed like a drumbeat as I walked to the front. Karen's eyes locked on me, cold and sharp. "Dr. Hale," she said, voice dripping with disdain, "you are not on the agenda." I laid the folder on the table in front of her. Funny thing about agendas, they don't mean much when the truth isn't on them. The room went dead silent. Then I opened the folder, sliding out the first page. A printed screenshot of 18 U.S.C. Section 1705, highlighted in bright yellow. "This is federal law," I said, my voice steady but loud enough to carry. "Destroying a mailbox is a felony, up to 3 years in prison. We all know what's been happening on Cedar Glen Drive." Karen stiffened. Allegations, rumors, nothing more. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the projector screen behind her flickered to life. Mrs. Harris's shaky video filled the wall, Karen's SUV nudging against a curb, the faint crunch of impact audible. Gasps rippled through the room. "That's not all," I continued, queuing up the next clip. The Ruiz boy, GoPro footage, catching her SUV idling near my driveway the night my third mailbox was flattened. Then a neighbor's testimony, then photos of the dent in her bumper against the mangled remains of my old post. One by one, the pieces stacked like bricks. Karen's smirk wavered. She glanced toward the board members at her side, searching for backup, but they looked away, lips pressed thin. I leaned closer, my voice dropping low, intimate, the way a doctor delivers bad news. "You didn't just find me, Karen. You vandalized my property, left notices after the fact, and lied about compliance. You've been abusing this neighborhood for years. But now," I gestured to the crowd, dozens of eyes fixed on her, "now people aren't afraid to speak." The tension snapped. Mrs. Harris stood, her voice ringing clear. "She fined me $200 for a garden gnome, said it violated aesthetics. I paid because I was scared." Then the Ruiz father spoke. "She threatened foreclosure over my daughter's chalk drawings on the sidewalk, said it was graffiti." Another neighbor shouted, "She tried to make me tear down my swing set." The room erupted, voices overlapping, decades of resentment spilling out at once. Karen pounded the gavel, shouting for order, but her voice was drowned in the swell of anger. The more she screamed, the less anyone listened. Finally, I raised my hand, and the room quieted enough for me to finish. "This isn't just about fines. This is about control. And tonight, Karen, that control ends." The silence that followed was heavy, electric. For a moment, Karen just sat there, jaw tight, eyes darting like a cornered animal. Then she shoved back her chair with a screech and stood, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You think you've won?" she spat. "You think a video and some complaints will change anything? I am the HOA. You'll regret this." Her voice cracked on the last word, and the board members beside her shifted uncomfortably. Finally, one of them, Mr. Peterson, a quiet man who'd sat through every meeting in stiff silence, spoke up. His voice was calm but firm. "Karen, maybe it's time we voted." A murmur spread like wildfire. "A vote." Karen froze, her face paling. "You can't." But the board was already nodding. And in that moment, I realized something. I hadn't just defended my mailbox. I'd lit a fire under an entire neighborhood. This wasn't the end, not yet. But for the first time, I saw the cracks in Karen's armor, and through those cracks, the light was pouring in. The boardroom had gone still, every eye fixed on Karen. Mr. Peterson's words hung heavy in the air. A vote. It was the first time anyone had dared suggest it aloud, and the reaction was instant. A wave of whispers spread across the crowded hall, the kind of buzz that told me the tide had shifted. Karen's face tightened. She banged the gavel so hard it cracked against the table. "There will be no vote," she snapped, voice shaking with rage. "I am the elected president of this HOA. You don't just strip me of my authority because a few disgruntled neighbors can't follow the rules." But the board wasn't listening. Peterson adjusted his glasses, steady and calm. "The bylaws allow for an emergency removal vote if the president is found guilty of misconduct. And I think tonight," he glanced around at his fellow board members, "we've all heard enough to justify it." Karen's head whipped toward them, eyes wide, desperate. "Don't you dare. I made this neighborhood what it is. I kept the lawns neat, the houses uniform. Without me, Cedar Glen falls apart." Another board member, Mrs. Jameson, shook her head. "No, Karen, you made this neighborhood afraid. That's not leadership." The murmurs swelled, louder this time, voices rising with every passing second. It was like watching years of silence crumble all at once. Neighbors who had been too scared to speak were now emboldened, standing straighter, voices firm. I could see it written all over her face. The realization that her grip was slipping, that the power she clutched so tightly was prying itself free. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to let go gracefully. Her hand shot into her purse, yanking out a manila folder thick with papers. She slapped it on the table, scattering documents across the board. You want to talk about misconduct? Fine, let's talk about Dr. Marcus Hale. My stomach sank, but I stood my ground. Karen snatched up a paper, waving it high. Here's his covenant violation for an oversized mailbox. Here's proof he installed an unapproved structure on his property without board approval. Here's his late HOA payment from 2019. Yes, I keep records. Her eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction as she dropped each sheet like a hammer. This man is no hero. He's a rule breaker, and you're all letting him manipulate you. The crowd stirred, some faces uncertain. For a split second, I felt the weight of every eye shift back to me. Karen's voice grew sharper, stronger, fueled by desperation. He's making a fool of this community, and you're all buying into it, but I won't stand for it. I'll take this to court. I'll bankrupt him and anyone else who stands with him. You hear me? Anyone. Her shrill echo bounced off the beige walls. I waited, letting the silence stretch until the tension threatened to snap. Then I leaned forward, planting both hands on the table. Karen, everything you just waved around, it doesn't matter, because my mailbox is compliant, my dues are paid, and your violations against me are fabricated. You want proof? I pulled out my phone, tapping the screen until the footage filled the projector again. The moment she shoved against the mailbox, kicked it, tried to wrench it loose. Her SUV idling nearby, her scowl clear as day. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. Mrs. Harris's voice rang out from the back, sharp and sure. That's the real misconduct, Karen, right there. The momentum swung back like a pendulum. People began to shout, no longer whispers but clear, bold words. Vote her out. Enough is enough. We're done with her. Peterson banged the gavel, not in anger but in resolution. Then it's settled. All in favor of an emergency vote to remove President Monroe from her position, raise your hand. Hands shot up across the room, not timidly but boldly. Nearly every neighbor in attendance raised their arm. The board followed suit, one by one. The only hand that stayed down was Karen's, trembling at her side. Her face drained, lips quivering. This is a coup, she whispered. You can't do this to me. Peterson's voice was calm, but it carried finality. The board has spoken. Effective immediately, you are removed from your position as president of the Cedar Glen Homeowners Association. For the first time since I'd met her, Karen didn't look angry. She looked small, fragile. She swayed on her heels, clutching the edge of the table like the floor was giving way beneath her. And then, without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, heels clicking furiously, the slam of the door echoing behind her. The room erupted. Cheers, applause, even tears. Neighbors hugged, clapped each other on the back, some shaking their heads in disbelief that it had finally happened. Frank lifted me off the ground in a bear hug, booming with laughter. Doc, you did it! You broke the witch's spell. But as the celebration swirled around me, I couldn't shake a nagging thought. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. Not really. People like her, when cornered, often came back meaner, more dangerous, more reckless. And something in the way she'd stormed out, silent, almost trembling, told me this wasn't finished. The board might have voted her out, the neighborhood might have cheered, but I knew deep down that Karen wasn't gone. She was plotting, and when she came back, it wouldn't be with fines or threats. It would be with something worse. For a few days, Cedar Glen felt lighter, almost normal. Neighbors waved at each other in the mornings. Kids played basketball in driveways without fear of fines. Mrs. Harris finally put her gnome back in the garden, polished and proud like a trophy. Even the air felt different, like someone had cracked a window in a stuffy room. But beneath that peace, I kept waiting, watching. Because Karen had vanished. No morning walks, no SUV circling like a shark, no pink slips tucked under windshield wipers, just silence from her beige McMansion at the end of the block. Curtains drawn, blinds closed. She was gone or hiding. On the fourth night, I found out which. It was late, past midnight. The street was quiet, only the hum of crickets and the occasional bark of a distant dog. I just settled onto the couch with a book when the security camera app pinged my phone. Motion detected, front yard. I tapped the screen, heart thudding. The feed flickered to life, grainy in the darkness. And there she was. Karen. Hair wild, barefoot, moving with the jittery urgency of someone unraveling. In one hand, a hammer. In the other, a flashlight that shook with her every step. She crept toward the fortress mailbox like a thief in her own kingdom. I froze, watching her circle, tapping the hammer against the steel walls like she was searching for a weak spot. She swung once hard. The hammer clanged, a sharp metallic echo cutting through the night. She swung again, harder, the sound ricocheting off the quiet houses. The mailbox didn't budge, not even a dent. But Karen wasn't stopping. I slipped on my boots, heart racing, and stepped onto the porch. The old wooden boards creaked under my weight, and her head snapped up, flashlight beam locking on me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, voice carrying across the lawn. Her face twisted, anger, desperation, madness all tangled together. "You ruined everything," she screamed. "You think you can embarrass me, turn them all against me? This street was mine." She raised the hammer again, but before it could fall, another porch light snapped on. Then another, and another. Doors opened, slippers shuffled, voices called out. Within seconds, half the neighborhood was awake, spilling into the street in robes and pajamas. Frank stormed out in his boxer shorts, shotgun slung casually across his shoulder. "Karen," he barked, "put the damn hammer down before you really regret it." Mrs. Harris had her phone out, recording from her porch. The Ruiz boy shouted, "She's vandalizing it, we've got proof." Karen spun in circles, wild-eyed, surrounded. Her flashlight beam darted across the growing crowd like a cornered animal looking for an escape. Then she did something I'll never forget. She ran to her SUV, parked crooked across the street, flung the door open, and gunned the engine. Tires screeched, headlights flared, and for a split second I realized exactly what she intended. She was going to ram it. My fortress mailbox, my property, with half the neighborhood watching. "Get back," I shouted, waving my arms as people scrambled to the sidewalks. The SUV roared, gears grinding, Karen's face twisted in rage behind the wheel. Then she floored it. The sound was deafening, rubber screaming, engine howling, the hulking SUV surging forward like a bull charging a matador. I braced myself for the crash, for steel twisting, concrete cracking. But when it hit, the world didn't shatter. The mailbox didn't move, not an inch. The SUV, though, the hood crumpled like a soda can, airbags exploded with a muffled boom. The windshield spiderwebbed. The entire vehicle jolted to a dead stop, steam hissing from the radiator. For a moment the street was silent but for the hiss of the engine and the chirp of stunned crickets. Then Frank let out a low whistle. "Mailbox, 1, Karen, 0. Neighbors erupted, some gasping, some laughing nervously, some shouting in disbelief. Phones captured everything, every angle, every second. And in the middle of it all, Karen sat slumped behind the deflated airbag, eyes dazed, hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Within minutes, red and blue lights flashed against the houses. The sheriff's deputies arrived, sirens wailing down the street. They pulled her from the wreckage, cuffed her trembling wrists, and read her rights as she sputtered excuses. His mailbox is illegal," she cried, voice cracking. "You don't understand, I was enforcing the rules." The deputy shook his head, unimpressed. "Ma'am, you just committed vandalism, reckless driving, and destruction of federal property. You're lucky nobody got hurt." They loaded her into the cruiser, neighbors cheering as the door slammed shut. Frank raised his beer high. "To justice," he hollered. Mrs. Harris dabbed her eyes with a tissue, whispering, "About time." I just stood there, staring at the fortress mailbox, its green paint gleaming under the flashing lights, not a scratch on it. Karen had thrown everything she had at me. Lies, fines, intimidation, even her SUV. And still the mailbox stood. But more importantly, so did we. The neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. The morning after Karen's arrest, Cedar Glen was unrecognizable. For years, this street had carried a quiet heaviness, the kind you didn't notice until it lifted. People avoided eye contact, Curtains stayed closed, neighbors whispered instead of spoke. But that Saturday morning the air felt lighter. Doors opened, laughter carried across lawns, and for the first time in a long time the neighborhood sounded alive. I walked down my driveway with a mug of coffee in hand, the smell of fresh cut grass mixing with the damp earth. The fortress mailbox stood tall, brass numbers gleaming in the sun, unscathed despite everything thrown at it. A symbol now, not just of resistance, but of resilience. Frank strolled over in his usual camouflage cap, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "Doc," he said, slapping my shoulder, "you've got the most famous mailbox in Travis County. Folks are calling it the Green Tank." I chuckled, sipping my coffee. As long as it keeps the mail safe, they can call it whatever they want. Across the street, Mrs. Harris waved from her porch, her garden gnome standing proudly at her feet again. The Ruiz kids were chalking a dragon across the sidewalk, no longer worried about fines or threats. And even quiet Mrs. Whittaker came over, her little dog yapping happily, to thank me for standing up. It wasn't just about me, it never had been. Later that week I got the news. Karen was officially charged: destruction of federal property, reckless endangerment, attempted vandalism. Her SUV was totaled, her reputation shredded. And with her removal from the HOA board, Cedar Glen finally had room to breathe. The board voted Peterson in as interim president, a calm, steady hand. He promised transparency, fairness, and most importantly, accountability. For once, it felt like more than empty words. But even in victory, I couldn't help thinking about Karen. I replayed the look on her face when the SUV crumpled against that mailbox, when the deputies closed the cruiser door behind her. It wasn't just anger. It was loss. Loss of control, of power, of the fear she'd used to keep everyone in line. And I realized something. People like Karen don't start out monsters. Somewhere along the way, they convince themselves they're the only ones who can keep order, the only ones who matter. And in chasing that power, they lose everything else. Sometimes the strongest cages aren't made of steel. They're made of fear. And Karen had been trapped in her own long before she ever touched my mailbox. A week later at the next community meeting, the room was packed again. But this time there was no tension, no gavel banging like a war drum. People laughed, shared snacks, even joked about the mailbox that took down Karen. The board listened, actually listened to concerns. For once, Cedar Glen felt like a neighborhood, not a kingdom. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. "I didn't set out to be anyone's hero," I said. "I just wanted my property respected, but what happened showed me something bigger. Bullies only win when we stay quiet. The second we stand together, they lose their power. That's the real victory." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It didn't need to be. It was warm, steady, human. The sound of people reclaiming something they thought they'd lost. That night back on my porch, I sat with Frank, 2 beers sweating on the railing. We watched the street settle into calm again, kids laughing, sprinklers hissing, cicadas starting their nightly chorus. Frank raised his can in a toast. "To the mailbox that stood its ground," he said. I clinked mine against his, smiling. "To neighbors who finally did the same." And in the quiet that followed, I thought about how fragile peace can be, how easily fear can take its place. But I also thought about the strength that comes from standing up, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. The mailbox was built of steel and concrete, sure, but what really made it indestructible wasn't the metal. It was the people who stood behind it. And that, I realized, was the kind of fortress no one could ever tear down. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.